Welcome back to the class video for Module 5, the second of two modules devoted to Rousseau's On Social Contract. In the first part of this class, we looked at the first two chapters of Book 3 and tried to understand how Rousseau is creating a bridge or trying to illustrate the relationship between social contract theory, or a theory of democratic revolution, and an older received wisdom that we're describing as classical constitutional science or Aristotelianism. This question matters to us because, as we'll see in the final segment of the course when we turn to the U.S. federal Constitution, the problem of resolving the conflict of principles and values between the values of the revolutionary period and in this older received wisdom, this understanding of the natural law of how governments work, was at the forefront of the minds of James Madison and the framers of the federal Constitution, and at the heart of the conflict between those Americans who supported the new Constitution and those who opposed it. Now, Rousseau's approach is very different, as we saw in the first part of class. Rousseau's approach is to introduce government as a third thing and create a triad where previously in books 1 and 2 he had been describing this binary relationship between each individual and their self-alienation, and then this collective entity that's created through that alienation, the general will or the sovereign. And in the relationship now with this third thing, Rousseau tries to describe, admittedly in some pretty bad math story problems there. You'll just get frustrated if you try to actually write these out as algebraic equations. But the underlying point is that he's trying to show the psychological relationship, this kind of psychological conflict between the individual and the collective. When you introduce government as a third thing, you create a three-way tension or relationship, and that battle is at the heart of Aristotle's three constitutional forms. And it's to those constitutional forms that we're going to turn now in this segment of the video. We've seen this before. This portion of the course and assigning this portion of Rousseau's On Social Contract is also important because I cannot rely on each one of you having taken foundations, and even if you did necessarily having read Aristotle's Politics, this is your kind of Cliff Note summary of Aristotle here in Book 3 of Rousseau. And Rousseau's approach here, or the problem he sets out for himself to solve, is to show how these constitutional forms have at their root, or they are expressions of imbalances, balance or imbalances between these three wills that are struggling for dominance in the natural law of how humans alienate themselves to create a political society. So let's turn now to the text and understand that what we're getting is a kind of shorthand summary of Aristotle, which would have been a kind of common received wisdom of how politics works before the introduction of the social contract theory in 17th century Britain. So we'll turn now and pick up with chapter 3 in the text. Okay, in chapter 3, Rousseau is going to lay out for us the three fundamental categories or types of constitutions. In the highlighted passages on the left-hand column of page 17, Rousseau writes, "In the first place, the sovereign may commit the charge of the government to the whole people or to the majority of the people, so that more citizens are magistrates than are mere private individuals. This form of government is called democracy. Or it may restrict the government to a small number, so that there are more private citizens than magistrates, and this is named aristocracy. Lastly, it may concentrate the whole government in the hands of a single magistrate from whom all others hold their power. This third form is the most usual and is called monarchy or royal government." So here we have Aristotle's three basic forms: rule of the many, the few, and the one. We need to take just a moment to clarify these terms, because in this translation, these terms citizen, magistrate, private individuals can be a little tricky for modern readers. When we modern American readers read charge the government to the magistrates, we very obviously think about office holders, politicians who are elected to office or appointed to office. That's our immediate reflexive association when we read the word magistrate. But we want to think much more broadly about that term magistrate here and think about any person who has any empowerment to participate in the political system in any aspect at all. The classic traits of sort of political empowerment in Aristotle are the right to vote or the obligation to serve on a jury or in a trial. In the jury setting, obviously voting is familiar to us as an expression of our consent and participation, choosing who gets to make the rules. In calling to be a juror, being called to be a juror, you are being charged with executing and enforcing the coercive power of the state. And so you are politically enabled. You are at the lowest level of the judicial system. So a better kind of metric or thermometer for modern readers to associate with that word magistrate is to think about who has the right to vote. Right? That's the simplest metaphor for modern students. So in the rule of the many, at least half of the people, anywhere between half and all of the people, have the right to vote. In an aristocracy, a minority of the people would have a right to vote. And in a monarchy, only one person has the right to vote. So we have the rule of, that means everyone who is politically empowered, the rule of the many, the rule of the few, or the rule of the one. And then Rousseau is going to give us a couple of kind of maxims or corollaries of these three types on the right-hand column of 17 in those final two paragraphs of chapter 3. He writes in that next to last paragraph, "There has been at all times much dispute concerning the best form of government, without consideration of the fact that each is in some cases the best, and in others the worst." This dispute that Rousseau describes is in fact foundational to Western political theory and will come back to us again when we get to the final segment of the course. Consider the question being asked. What is the best form of government, right? There's a dispute about what's the best form of government, and Rousseau is observing, well, there isn't necessarily one best form of government. In some cases, one type is best, and in other cases, that's the worst form, and a different type would be best. If you took foundations and read both Plato and Aristotle, you'll have a sense of this, how fundamental this difference in perspective is. Consider Plato. Plato described for you what he thought was the perfect political system, right? This ideal republic. And in Plato's mind, there is one perfect form, and man is imperfect and should aspire to live under that one perfect form. That is to say, man has an essential nature that is best suited for one type of government. To the extent that man does not or cannot live under that form of government, it reflects man's own corruption. It reflects his inability to live in his highest state, right? So if we all could get along, we would have guardians and auxiliary and craftsmen, and everybody would know their place. There'd be perfect consensus on the justice and the reasonableness of the law and all of that. If you read Aristotle's Politics, there's a famous passage in the Politics where Aristotle says, so what's the perfect form of government? I don't think I can answer that, and I don't know that it would even be helpful to me if I could, because I don't live in a perfect world. There are better and worse constitutions for different peoples, and even for the same peoples in different time periods and cultural transitions. An aristocracy might be best at one time, a monarchy might be best at another, and a democracy might be great at a third time. That Aristotelian neutrality about which is the best form of government, right? It could be any one of them, is why we refer to Aristotelianism as a constitutional science, right? A chemist is not rooting for one atom or another, or one element or another to come out of the, or they shouldn't be, right? If they're being neutral and objective. And in the same way, Aristotle doesn't presume to say which of these, now each has advantages and disadvantages. Each can be in its good form and in a bad form. And you would much prefer the good form of any one of the three to the bad form of any one of the three. But the three themselves each have strengths and weaknesses. That principle of neutrality, that kind of attempt to be scientifically detached from the subject of politics and to consider all forms of government neutrally or objectively, is going to be a central conflict when we turn to talk about the federal Constitution. Consider John Locke, which we've already looked at. In Locke's model, there's really only one institution that can adequately represent the will of the people, and that's Parliament. So in Locke's scheme, he has a very difficult time imagining, even conceptualizing the problem of, well, if Parliament gets to be the umpire over king, who is the umpire over Parliament? That question doesn't occur to Locke, because Locke can only imagine that Parliament, that is a legislature, that is the rule of the many, can be a valid expression of the sovereign authority of the people. That's one example of the implicit conceptual conflict between social contract theory, or theory of the right of democratic revolution, and this older Aristotelian approach. Rousseau here is siding with Aristotle and saying that no one form is necessarily better or worse than the other. There are better and worse in any particular situation, but we're going to see that same conceptual problem return to us. Rousseau now wants to draw a different conclusion from this principle that, or this maxim that there's not necessarily one perfect form. He's going to come back to this ratio, if you remember from chapter 2, about the size of government versus the size of the country or the population that you're trying to rule. In the final paragraph, Rousseau writes, if in the different states the number of supreme magistrates should be an inverse ratio to the number of citizens, it follows that generally democratic government suits small states, aristocratic government those of middle size, and monarchy great ones. Now this recurs to the principle that we discussed in the first part of this class, that there is a kind of common sense wisdom, a common understanding in political theory from Aristotle up to the 18th century, that if you have a large country or a large diverse population that you're trying to govern, the only effective government or constitutional form for that kind of country is a monarchy, because a monarchy is the most powerful government. It takes the least amount of effort to put the government into operation because it just requires the will of one person. If you want to try a democratic government, a government of the people, a government in which everyone gets a say in the laws, the only kind of country that you should try to implement that kind of constitution with is a small country. That is, either small in geographic size or small in the number of people you're trying to govern. And as we'll see in just a second, it's very important that all those people are very much alike each other, that there's homogeneity in culture and ethnicity and religion and economic interest and all of those things. This is a kind of common sense maxim or corollary of Aristotle's political theory that virtually everyone in the 18th century would have understood, and it'll come up again in the final part of the course because this principle, this Aristotelian principle, democratic government suits small states, is one of the chief arguments for the advocates of states' rights or the opponents of this new federal authority that is represented in the 1787 Federal Constitution. So we're going to come back to that maxim as well. Here in Rousseau now, he's going to turn in chapters 4, 5, and 6, and he's going to describe the three forms of government in more detail, or the three types of constitutions in more detail. And the overlying principle here, because lying underneath this is these dynamic relationships among these three competing wills. If you remember, the particular will, the general will, and the corporate will. And what Rousseau wants to show is, under each of these three constitutional types, is this tension of forces going on. And so we want to think about this as a kind of Goldilocks metaphor. Goldilocks comes in, breaks into the bear's house, and there's three of everything, right? The first bed's too hard, second bed's too soft, and the third bed is just right. The porridge is too hot, the porridge is too cold, and then the third porridge is just right. We want to think about Rousseau here describing a kind of Goldilocks spectrum where the two extremes are out of balance, and we have to come to the middle to bring these three competing wills into equilibrium. So we're going to take chapter 4, democracy, and we'll skip chapter 5 and we'll go to chapter 6, monarchy, and we'll see the two extremes, and then we'll come back to chapter 5, aristocracy, and see the happy middle. Rousseau begins chapter 4. He who makes the law knows better than anyone else how it should be executed and interpreted. It seems then impossible to have a better constitution than that in which the executive and legislative powers are united. But this very fact renders the government in certain respects inadequate, because things which should be distinguished are confounded, and the prince and the sovereign, being the same person, form, so to speak, no more than a government without a government. This is a wonderful expression of the paradox of democracy, right? It seems the best form because the people are sovereign, and so we assume, or it seems a logical conclusion, that the rule of the many would be the most complete and perfect expression of the desires of the collective. But he says, the prince and the sovereign being the same person. Remember, the prince is the body of the government, whether it's one person in charge or 99 out of 100 in charge. Whatever that number is, they're called the prince. So the prince, and you remember the sovereign is the general will. That's the collective entity we created when we alienated ourselves. So the prince and the sovereign, the body of the government, and the collective of the people, being the same person, so to speak, form no more than a government without government. Remember the paradox or the dilemma that we discussed from John Locke. If we, in the state of nature, truly were rational and cooperative, then we would not need government, right? That would be the evidence that we were actually cooperative and rational. We would never have to have created government in the first place. That we need government demonstrates that we require restraint, right? That we don't know our own interest, or we can't reconcile the conflict between our self-interest and the interest of the community, and we need an umpire or a referee. So Rousseau is observing here, right, in his own kind of, Riddler style, that democracy, in fact, is not a government, in the highlighted passage in the middle of the left-hand column on 18. It is against the natural order for the many to govern and the few to be governed. And this wonderful final highlighted passage on the right-hand column, final passage of the chapter, were there a people of gods, their government would be democratic. So perfect a government is not for man. Again, think of Locke's paradox about human nature and whether we're truly rational and cooperative. Rousseau is here observing, which is consistent with his description of the state of nature and our natural state as unimaginative animals and beasts, right? If you recall from Module 4, this description then is consistent with that understanding of human nature. Democracy is innately unstable. It contains the seeds of its own destruction, and so it's a very delicate thing that you can only do in very rare circumstances. Come back to the final paragraph on the left-hand column of 18. Besides, how many conditions that are difficult to unite does such a government presuppose? First, a very small state, where the people can readily be got together and where each citizen can with ease know all the rest. Secondly, great simplicity of manners to prevent business from multiplying and raising thorny problems. Next, a large measure of equality in rank and fortune, without which equality of rights and authority cannot long subsist. And lastly, little or no luxury. For luxury either comes of riches or makes them necessary. It corrupts at once rich and poor, the rich by possession and the poor by covetousness, etc. Next paragraph. This is why a famous writer has made virtue the fundamental principles of republics. For all these conditions could not exist without virtue. And this famous writer, of course, is Aristotle. The notion here again is a kind of classic Aristotelian maxim that we looked at and discussed in the first part of this module. If you want to have a democracy, you're nuts. I understand. I'm rooting for you. I totally sympathize with why you think that would be a great form of government. But if you're that crazy and you're really going to try it, the only place where you should try it is a very small country, ideally something the size of a city-state. One big city where everybody can be a lot alike, have common economic interests, have common race and ethnicity and religious beliefs and all the rest. Because in a democracy, there is no authority higher than the people. And if the people are divided, you're just inviting a civil war. You're just inviting conflict. Where people have, in communities where there are lots of division, you all the more need a strong umpire or referee to negotiate between people's conflicts. So democracy is a beautiful thing. It's a poetic image of justice. It's just not practical for the real world. And again, we're going to see exactly this principle come out of the writings of those states' rights anti-federal power writers in the American founding. So here in Rousseau, bestowing the authority of government on everyone who is a part of the collective is an understandable and a sympathetic error, but nonetheless a fundamental error in structuring government. So too hot here with democracy. Let's skip chapter 5, because that's the one he's going to like best. That's going to be the resolution of the problem. And let's see the other end of the spectrum when this balance gets out of whack in Rousseau's description of monarchy. At the bottom of the right-hand column of 19, Rousseau begins chapter 6. So far, we have considered the prince as a moral and collective person, unified by the force of laws and the depository in the state of the executive power. We have now to consider this person when it is gathered together into the hands of a natural person, a real man, who alone has the right to dispose of it in accordance with the laws. Such a person is called a monarch or king. In contrast with other forms of administration, in which a collective being stands for an individual, in this form, an individual stands for a collective being, so that the moral unity that constitutes the prince is at the same time a physical unity, and all the qualities, which in other cases are only with difficulty brought together by the law, are found naturally united. Thus the will of the people, the will of the prince, the public force of the state, and the particular force of government all answer to a single motive power. All the springs of the machine are in the same hands. The whole move towards the same end. There are no conflicting movements to cancel one another, and no kind of constitution can be imagined in which a less amount of effort produces a more considerable amount of action. Now, we've already discussed and thought about this underlying principle here, right? The tyrant, the single ruler, does not have to call together committees, does not have to take public input in considering their policies, certainly does not have to wait and submit their ideas to the vote of the people. The individual ruler, whether it's a good person or an evil person, can simply act and order people into action to carry out their will. So from the point of view, if you go back to chapter 5 and Rousseau's description of the social compact and total alienation, if your desire, if your image is perfect collectivity, perfect consensus around action, everybody in agreement responding to one will, one desire, then you can see how seductive the rule of the one is from a Rousseauian democratic perspective. The one ruler who embodies the will of the nation, embodies the desires of the culture, is the most effective agent in carrying out that will or desire. So there is this kind of innate, intrinsic seduction that the Rousseauian or the continental tradition has with the rule of what we in the West call the tyrant or the dictator. For Rousseau, the dominance of the individual will of the ruler is precisely the source of corruption in monarchy. In the final paragraph on the left-hand column of 20, kings desire to be absolute, and men are always crying out to them from afar that the best means of being so is to get themselves loved by their people. This precept is all very well, and even in some respects very true. Unfortunately, it will always be derided at court. The power which comes of a people's love is no doubt the greatest, but it is precarious and conditional, and princes will never rest content with it. The best kings desire to be in a position to be wicked if they please, without forfeiting their mastery. And then skipping down, their personal interest is that the people should be weak, wretched, and unable to resist them. Well, if you took foundations and you read Machiavelli's The Prince, certainly in your class discussion your attention was called to the famous passages in Machiavelli where he makes exactly this point. He asks famously, is it better for the prince to be loved or feared? And his answer is, well, everybody loves being loved, but being loved is not reliable, and being feared is a much more reliable lever of power. Where Machiavelli may be saying that in half admiring tones, Rousseau here is describing that as the fundamental weakness or instability of the rule of the one. It is that innate compulsion, because the king is a natural human being subject to the same emotions and passions and self-interest as every other human being. There is this innate or intrinsic compulsion in the rule of the one to confuse what's good for yourself, your own personal desire, and project that onto that's what the culture or the society wants. It must want that because it's what I want. And that's a innate conceptual confusion that results necessarily from this form of government. So let's pause before we turn back then to the happy middle, to aristocracy, and look again at these graphic illustrations of these relationships. So if we look again briefly at this attempt to illustrate these ratios or these relationships, in the top right-hand column of the screen, you have these versions of the magistrate's three wills. He told us in chapters 1 and 2 that there are these three competing wills within the magistrate: the general will, the particular will, and the corporate will. And now we see this illustration in the rule of the one on the left-hand side, the particular will, that is the will of the king, and the corporate will, the will of the government, become conflated. and they join together, and they tend to overwhelm and corrupt the general will. The general will does not get observed in the rule of the one. And the exact opposite is happening in the rule of all. Because everyone is a member of government, the general and the corporate wills become conflated. They become one thing, and they overwhelm and dominate the particular will, that is, the actual interests of the individual members of the society. So both of these constitutional forms are out of whack, right? They're extreme versions of the what should be in balance. They represent imbalance in this competition of wills. So let's turn back now and look at the happy medium, aristocracy. And once again, we're going to see three versions of aristocracy. The first two versions are the extreme versions that are out of whack, and we're going to find that Goldilocks happy middle in the middling version of aristocracy. So let's turn now back to chapter 5. We find out immediately in chapter 5 that aristocracy proposes a solution to the fundamental problem of both democracy and monarchy. Both the rule of the many and the rule of the one tend to conflate things. Things tend to get confused together, but aristocracy keeps them separate. Rousseau writes in the first paragraph, "We have here two quite distinct moral persons, the government and the sovereign, and in consequence two general wills, one general in relation to all the citizens, the other only for the members of the administration. Thus, although the government may regulate its internal policy as it pleases, it can never speak to the people save in the name of the sovereign, that is, of the people itself, a fact which must not be forgotten." So, if the basic problem of the rule of the many is virtually everyone gets to be part of government, and therefore there's no distinction between the government and the people, well, the few won't have that problem, because the few necessarily entails less than a majority. On the other end, if the problem with monarchy is that the one person who gets to rule tends to conflate their self-interest, their particular will, with the desires of the government and the people, that can't happen either, because there has to be more than one in the rule of the few. So it's the happy Goldilocks middle between the imbalance of the two extremes. And Rousseau replicates that conceptual triad once again within the category of aristocracy. At the top of 19, he's going to introduce us to three different types of aristocracy, and once again, we're going to find our solution in the happy middle. At the top of the left-hand column of 19, the first societies governed themselves aristocratically. The heads of families took counsel together on public affairs. The young bowed without question to the authority of experience, hence such names as priests, elders, senate, and gerontes. The savages of North America govern themselves in this way even now, and their government is admirable. But in proportion as artificial inequality produced by institutions became predominant over natural inequality, riches or power were put before age, and aristocracy became elective. Finally, the transmission of the father's power along with his goods to his children by creating patrician families made government hereditary, and there came to be senators of 20. And then this summation. There are then three sorts of aristocracy: natural, elective, and hereditary. The first is only for simple peoples. The third is the worst of all governments. The second is best, and is aristocracy properly so called. So notice that aristocracy, even a natural aristocracy, it explicitly asserts that some people are better than others. Some people are wiser, some people are more knowledgeable, some people are smarter than others, and it is the appropriate obligation of those of us who are dumber and less wise to defer and consent and observe the rules created by those who are better than us. So it necessarily cuts against the principle of natural equality that pervades social contract theory. And so the corrective, or the kind of parameters that can be set around that to reconcile it with social contract theory, is this principle of elections, which is a kind of strange or paradoxical condition to set on aristocracy, because of course our sort of intuitive response when we see the word aristocracy is to think of medieval Europe and the reign of dukes and earls and lords and barons, and the defining feature of that form of aristocracy, of course, is that it is hereditary, that it's defined by the bloodlines of the families who hold these offices. We do not normally think of dukes and barons and earls and counts being elected by the serfs that work the farms around their castles, right? So it's a kind of quizzical, again, Rousseau playing the Riddler here and trying to come up with paradoxical phrases. Now, the effect of elections, though, is to divert the criteria from wealth or from bloodline to hopefully true wisdom and merit and sort of investment in the common good or the public good, etc. in the next highlighted passage. Besides the advantage that lies in the distinction between the two powers, it presents that of its members being chosen, for in popular government all the citizens are born magistrates. But here magistracy is confined to a few, who become such only by election. By this means, uprightness, understanding, experience, and all other claims to preeminence in public esteem become so many further guarantees of wise government. And so through elections, we can reconcile having popular government with common sense, common wisdom, in the final highlighted passage there, that it is the best and most natural arrangement that the wisest should govern the many, when it is assured that they will govern for its profit and not for their own. It is appropriate, Rousseau is saying, for the people to vote if they will vote for the people who are better than themselves, if they will identify and select their natural superiors, the natural aristocracy among their society, which does not mean the great-great-grandchild of some old duke who won a battle 3 centuries ago. It means whoever's the smartest and best able to lead. The best form of government, according to Rousseau, is that government in which the truly wise and enlightened and noble are chosen by the people at large to represent them. This again creates that balance of forces that he's looking for, right? It maintains the equilibrium of the particular will, the general will, and the corporate will, particularly because the form of government is neither everyone or one person. And then within the options of the few, that form that reconciles natural equality, everyone's right to have a say, with the need to have the wisest and the smartest and the most public-spirited actually get to make the decisions. So we're finding equilibrium upon equilibrium upon equilibrium. That's why this is the center of Rousseau's theory of constitutional order. For our purposes, it's very important because, again, we're going to come back to this in the last portion of the course, and we will see the Americans having a debate about what is the principle of representation in their early constitutions, and we'll see an argument. One view of representation is, I'm choosing that person to go and do exactly what I would do if I had the time to go and cast the ballot myself, right? That person is there to represent my interests. Another view, as we'll see, is that no, the representative has to transcend the self-interests of their constituents and look to the common good of the collective. And we'll see that debate, that conceptual problem in the nature of representation in the final readings of the semester. For Rousseau here, what Rousseau is describing as a elective aristocracy is in its essential conceptual elements what James Madison is going to describe as a republic, and describing a republic to distinguish it from a democracy. For James Madison, a democracy is in a place where you elect a representative to go do exactly what you would do if you were in office yourself. For Madison, a republic is a place where you elect someone to go do what you're not smart enough and wise enough and public spirited enough to do yourself. And so you got to pick someone better than you. Well, when we get to that portion of the course, we'll want to recall then Rousseau's depiction here. Looking again then at this illustration of Aristotle's theory of constitutional forms, we can see how Rousseau is trying to describe each form as a relative balance or ratio among the three competing wills. For Rousseau, the mixed polity there at the center of the illustration, which he addresses in chapter 7, is not so much about mixing and matching types, but emphasizing that this tension of wills exists along one continuum. Essentially, Rousseau will observe that the categories are kind of artificial. We're really talking about the spectrum between one and all. And we're dividing it into these three because three is appropriate to illustrate the number of wills that are in competition with each other, right? So the psychology of the social contract explains the origins of Aristotle's constitutional forms. As we turn now to the last portion of the text, we see we have one more critical conceptual element, and that is to describe change, how these constitutions change, or what is the nature of revolution. And we'll see in these final chapters that Rousseau's conception of revolution is radically different than John Locke's. We'll turn to that in the final portion of the course or class.